Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
President Trump is taking this economy in a different direction. He ran on that, he promised it, and now he's delivering.
We're in the process of imposing reciprocal tariffs.
This is going to hurt our economy before we get to any possible retaliation.
Thank you for being such a pro-business, pro-innovation president. We're very excited to see what you're doing to make all of our companies and our entire country so successful.
The big promise was that he was going to bring down prices and make America affordable again. And everything he's done is the opposite of that.
We had the greatest economy in history. This economy, in my opinion, is going to blow it away.
Let's put it this way. It's going to be a very interesting Davos.
I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and welcome to Trumponomics from Davos, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, this week from the top of a mountain. How he's already shaped the global economy for the movers and shakers descending on Switzerland for the World Economic Forum this week, and what on earth is going to happen next. We're recording this on Monday, 19th of January at Bloomberg House, close to the main conference centre in Davos, and I have some of Bloomberg's wisest with me to discuss the next chapter of Trumponomics, what the president might have in store for Davos men and women when he speaks here later this week. First, welcome to the stage, Annmarie Hordern, who is familiar to many as a co-host and roving DC correspondent for Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Television. Sridhar Natarajan, who is Bloomberg News' chief Wall Street correspondent, and our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait. I was thinking on the way here, there is a sense of kind of déjà vu because exactly, turn the clock back 12 months. John, you and I were here. Maybe some of the audience were here. But if you think of what has happened in the last 12 months, I can't think of much else that has stayed the same in this first year of Donald Trump's second term. We will have noticed that quite a lot in the World Economic Forum agenda, the names of the official sessions have changed quite a lot, even less about climate change, diversity, inclusion. And I've noticed a lot of dialogue and honest conversations. That seems to be the sort of title of most of the sessions. John, since President Trump confirmed relatively early that he was going to come, we have, I think, a record number of world leaders who've all rushed to come too. Quite a few of them want to have an honest conversation about Greenland. This crisis over Greenland is happening in real time, but could it possibly be resolved this week? Or, given the mood music we're hearing, could this be the week that Europe decides, with Donald Trump, it's not really the art of the deal, it's the art of fighting back?
I suppose, well, two things. It is a kind of monarchical administration, so the king comes somewhere, everyone else immediately shuttles across. It's very similar to the kind of 16th century or something when Louis XIV decides to go somewhere and everyone comes. That was a bit later than the 16th century, but the same idea. I think in terms of whether Europe fights, I think this is. I think this is the one thing which even the somewhat jelly-spined leaders of Europe, they really can't take someone just grabbing part of their territory. And I think you've already seen in people like Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Merz a bit, you've seen people saying, look, this really isn't going to work. The division is coming about what exactly the response would be with this issue about whether they go to tariffs or whether they look for other means. And I think the reason why is because this is such a strange thing. It's not really possible to declare that this is within the normal bounds of national security. It's just simply saying, I want to increase the land area of the United States of America, because most of the things to do with security you can cover through bases and things like that. So I think even for the Europeans, and let's be really honest, no one has ever lost money betting against the Europeans caving. Then actually, in this particular case, I think this is such an outrageous thing. They will do something. And the fact he's come out this morning with the thing about, which we reported first, about being annoyed with the Norwegians for not giving him the Nobel Peace Prize, that adds to the general sense of it being a sort of monarchical decision. And I think there's a certain point at which other democracies can't really live with that.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer at a press conference today on Monday, and you got the sense that he just had felt he had to respond because of the sheer weight of public opinion over the weekend.
And so any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. That right is fundamental, and we support it.
You have to feel amazingly sorry for Keir Starmer, not that we do that often, but Keir Starmer sort of 4 or 5 days ago, it wasn't looking too bad. He thought the one part of his administration that had gone reasonably well was foreign policy. And he had got a special deal with America, and he got a sort of deal with Europe. And then to get exposed on something where even he will find it difficult to back down, I think that makes it very, very hard. I think in the end, taking territory, that is the whole basis of why the West has rallied behind Ukraine. It's very different. It's very difficult when one of your allies does it.
I wanted to get onto the sort of corporate perspective on this, but just one more on Greenland. I mean, you're right that Europe doesn't have a reputation of having been really hard-nosed on these things. And the striking thing about the year since we were last here was how much Europe caved to pretty much everything. There was no retaliation on tariffs. Now they're talking about red lines, but they're also only talking about sending 15 individuals to Greenland as opposed to 15,000.
I think Trump said, surely, the French have sent 15 people. He thought they meant 15,000, and it turns out to be 15 people.
I mean, realistically, how can there be a muscular response?
There's division on that, and there is obviously people like Orban in Hungary who can make things difficult. But I think straightforwardly, Trump's biggest problems at the moment is many people would bet he's going to lose the midterms. What's the biggest issue there? Affordability. A full-on tariff war. I think the Europeans, at least in this case, have the ability to call that in. They've actually prepared all the ammunition before. Again, a jelly-spined group of people. But in this particular case, they actually have a weapon prepared for themselves, so they don't have to go through all that prevarication.
Well, Annmarie, we've mentioned the domestic front and affordability, which is the great buzzword in the US for this year as we go to the midterms. The president, to most people here on the world stage, seems to be at the peak of his powers, and he's extended those powers domestically enormously. But we have had in the last few weeks a sort of sign of some pushback, behind the scenes. A lot of the spending bills, spending cuts that the administration was hoping to see in domestic programs have all been sort of wound back in Congress. We've had a pretty vigorous response, even from some senior Republicans, to the further attack on the Federal Reserve. We may even get a decision this week, even before people are listening to this show, from the Supreme Court saying that he can't actually use tariffs for anything he wants. I mean, is this possibly the high watermark for Trumponomics domestically anyway?
Including maybe these tariffs he's talking about for the Europeans. I think for Trump right now in the whole White House, they are just laser focused. Their North Star is Tuesday, November 3rd for the midterm elections. To John's point, conventional wisdom, they're likely going to lose the House. This is his last opportunity. And polls continuously show that Trump ran on affordability. He ran on inflation being too high. And there's still price levels that are hurting everyday Americans, especially things like groceries, even though things like gasoline have come down. So in his speech here, he will have the domestic audience in mind. They've already teased out a number of issues. Capping credit card fees, which I know Sri is going to talk about, housing, how to get more Americans on the housing market, going after defense contractors about their dividends and buybacks, given the fact that the United States has $1 trillion defense budget, and they are obviously privy to that. So he's really going towards these populist policies that you would hear from the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Bernie Sanders, who try to attract Americans to stick with him ahead of the midterm elections. I think his biggest issue in Davos is, does that message get completely muddled by what many in Washington would call a distraction for something like Greenland?
He lives through how things will be seen on TV. And here you have a massive global stage, but to your point, he's also going to be speaking to a domestic audience. How is he going to balance those two things, especially when a lot of people here will be looking at the US economy and saying, whatever we say, it's performing better than most of ours?
US economy is doing well, GDP is doing well, stock market's at a record high. even though there have been concerns about Fed independence, the market has shrugged it off. I mean, the bond market only moved when Trump said on TV to Kevin Hassett, I think I'm going to maybe keep you where you are. So they're potentially pricing in someone a little bit more credible, or someone like a more hawkish Kevin Warsh. I think Trump's main message is going to be talking to what he would call the global elite, and how something like the World Economic Forum has some of the smartest, most elitist people in the world, but it hasn't delivered for everyday people. To your point earlier, you see the different names on the panels. It's not about diversity, equity, inclusion, and climate. It's actually about the basics, what I think a lot of conservatives in America would say the World Economic Forum has strayed away from. I'm told the speech is still being written, and maybe by the time he gives it, it'll be written a few more times and lots of tweaks.
See whether the auto cue is working.
Yeah. Oh, he likes to weave, so he definitely will go off script, I'm sure. He'll call out individuals. You know, I've traveled with him now a lot. I'm sure if he sees Jensen Huang, he'll immediately say, Jensen came to support me. So he definitely will go off script, where sometimes you get more interesting comments. But I think that's how he's going to frame why he decided to come to bring the largest U.S. delegation to Davos.
Sridhar, Annmarie mentioned that he's been lurching towards quite a lot of populist options for affordability, and often feels like every morning and there's a new one that's come through social posts, whether it's capping credit card fees to 10%, stopping private companies from buying residential real estate. I mean, some of these things, you know, they got used to tariffs, but some of these things really go to the business model of some of the world's most successful companies.
And the truth is, even though the US economy is doing so well, the company stocks are doing so well, the CEOs are not going to bed every night not worried. They are waking up with a headache because there is real tension. John talks about the jelly-spined political leaders in Europe. What do you talk about corporate leaders, corporate America, across the globe, like invisible spine? We are dealing with a world of radical uncertainty for them. Former UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talks about this idea that the old world order is gone. The order that businesses got used to, the rules-based system that we all got used to, that's gone. There's no point sitting around and moaning about it. So what's interesting is when you talk to the CEOs this week, the philosophy right now at least seems to be, don't think about Trump. They're trying to shrug it off. They're trying to focus at business's hand and saying, my job is to run the business. If the US were to attack Iran tonight, tomorrow morning, I still will have to run a business. That works until it doesn't, which is, again, when we talk about how this new year has started off. We've gone from Venezuela to housing to the ideas on credit cards to, before Trump left for Davos, this threat about suing America's largest bank, JP Morgan. You can't hope that the fire will not come to your front door and operate your business that way.
Yeah, and I have to say, full disclosure, as a former employee of JP Morgan, you do notice that Jamie Dimon did actually come back pretty forcefully on that threat of 10% of capping of credit card interest. And understandably, since it is such a major part of JP Morgan's business, you say they're trying to just act as if it will go away or just hope that it'll go away. But they have to also observe that this is such an unpredictable administration that any amount of currying favour and all the things that they've done that they thought would protect them don't seem to protect companies. I mean, Exxon has also been sort of punished for being a little bit honest about how long it might take to get oil production back in Venezuela. I mean, is that also causing some chief executives to think about plan B rather than just being totally focused on the US?
Which also, by the way, goes back to the point about Jamie Dimon forcefully responding to the credit card cap proposal, the rate cap proposal. What all the CEOs right now are doing are choosing to be silent by and large, but responding to very specific policy changes. But when you have a lot of craziness across the board and you don't have a voice in unison, you don't have a corporate bloc as such, then they will get steamrolled again and again and again. The thing is, the pragmatic approach they seem to be taking right now is all the growth is in the US. Every extra dollar you have, you want to invest it back in the US. So it almost makes sense for them, and the most practical approach for them is right now align themselves and line up behind the muscular and political will of the United States. Much harder for companies outside of the US to take such an approach.
I mean, for the rest of the world, John, And you're also someone who's kind of written books about the operations of capitalism. I mean, it's not just that Donald Trump has sort of taken us away from a rules-based world and international norms and all of those things that we talk about all the time. It sort of feels like it's about everything being on the table all the time. Like if you're an electrician and you're trying to mend a bit of the circuit, you normally disconnect it from the rest of the circuit in order to fix it. But with him, everything is live all the time. Whether you got the Peace Prize can blow up your trade relationship or your defense relationship. I mean, how does that change the way the global economy works?
Two different things. One is very much the work that Sridhar and Annmarie were talking about, which is kind of Trumponomics. It's about Trump. And as you say, everything is on the table. Anything could happen. And I think that is a kind of monarchical thing. There is a king who any morning can wake up and decide to head in a particular direction. And on the whole, you are basically best, if you're running a business, kind of keeping your head down, as you say, taking longer-term decisions where you can. And if he actually really physically attacks something which is absolutely crucial to you, like credit cards with JP Morgan, yes, you fire back on that. But the general advice to CEOs at the moment is try and stay friends with him, try and take advantage of him when he's spending money for some particular reason, but don't do it. But the more difficult world, I think, for CEOs, which you could argue goes back to COVID as much as anything, is this world where suddenly you are going to deal with a world where government of all sorts matters much more than it did. And you're also dealing with an America. Trump is very keen on pushing China, and he is protectionist. But you're going to come out of this, I think, regardless of whether you end up with son of Trump, daughter of Trump, or a Democrat, you're going to end up with America, which is still, I think, a much more protectionist and a much more kind of keen to take on China in the international sphere than you went into it. So I think basically businesses are taking one set of decisions, which is just how do we get through this next period? And the monarchy may last to November, or it may last all the way to 2 and a bit years to the end of the presidency. And we'll wait and see what happens in the midterms. But their betting will be that Trump will become gradually less powerful. But you have this other longer-term world underneath it, which is much, much harder, I think, for many companies, especially global companies, to try and navigate.
But that's why I wonder, when one talks about Plan B, right now, at least in the advanced economies, where the growth is in the US, but you see Canada, others talking about diversifying their alliances, opening up new trade agreements with China. They may not be the most attractive partner, but they might well be the most predictable and reliable partner in this environment.
And that's interesting. If you look at where Canada has ended up, because if you buy what I've said, and virtually every poll shows it, Americans feel China is a competitor in a big way. You could argue that if you were advising governments around the rest of the world, you would say, look, no matter what Trump does, it really doesn't make much sense for you to cozy up to China, because actually that's going to be an issue in American politics forever. And America is always, perhaps increasingly, is going to get more and more strident about that. And yet there you see Canada beginning to move in that direction. Europe as well, you hear people, quite sensible people, saying, no, we need to have a plan B, not just the conventional Paris consensus, if one could call it, that America is generally wrong about most things. Quite sensible people are saying we do need an alternative. That is a consequence, I think, of Trump.
But also just talking about your plan B, just to prove how difficult it is to plan for all of this, if you were thinking about inauguration a year ago, you were pretty certain that China will face the brunt of the first year of Trump 2.0. At least that was the rhetoric coming out. 1 year later, what you have is record trade surplus for China, the maximum number of listings on the Hong Kong exchange. They've come out pretty well. They don't look to be struggling as much as, say, your traditional allies, where all the pain point has been focused in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. So how do you plan for a world like that, where you come in with the assumption the one thing you were certain about is that Trump is bad news for China, but when you look at 25% of the second term that's already passed, it's nowhere close to that?
I think that ties very quickly into the first conversation, because at least somebody close to Starmer, somebody close to Macron, we say, look, China stood up to Trump, and it did okay. Europe is not without some degree of leverage in these things.
And China was able to have that surplus with actually their exports into the United States going down, which means they're pushing their products in other markets. And I think this is the problem Europe's in, and this unintended consequence of some of Trump's policies. You would want from this administration early on talked about like a North America fortress to combat China. But we just sort of lost Prime Minister Mark Carney. We lost the Prime Minister of Spain, Sanchez. And Europe is being hollowed out, its industrial base, by China. Look at all the deals that are being done with BYD. Look at what's going on with Germany. And I think the Trump administration would want Europe, the same way they acted about NATO, anchor the conversation to this extreme. Reports in his first term, is he going to leave NATO or not? The end goal was he got European countries to increase their defense. I think the end goal this administration would like to see is them take a harder line on China. But that's incredibly hard to do when you're talking about going after Greenland.
This is the flip side of this is the flip side that is negative for the US of having everything be on the table. You can't expect your closest allies to back you, whether it's on Ukraine or in Gaza or on China, if you're attacking them on all these other fronts.
Right. Although Trump might use it as points of leverage to get to end destinations. But it is true. He views everything as a negotiating. No deal is really ever done. It's just a constant conversation.
But if no deal's ever done, what's the point of doing a deal?
It's a great question.
I think that might be for me. That's the question of this week. I think, or at least that chief executives might ask.
It's a very bizarre thing, Greenland. I spent a long time writing about conservative America. If Trump deals with Iran, if Trump deals with Cuba, he will go into the conservative halos of history. You know, he was the man who managed to change Cuba, the man who changed Iran. Nowhere in all the millions of words that have been written in the Republican Party and conservative America has the word Greenland appeared once. It wasn't considered a core priority of the right in America to want these things. Venezuela may be quite useful. They were a pain in the neck, but it's not as big as some of these other things. So why exactly is he going this hard on it?
So just shifting back again a little bit to the domestic, Annmarie, if the Supreme Court does rule that the president can't just slap tariffs on any country he wants for any reason, or at least not without congressional approval, how does the administration respond to that?
Trump has talked about ahead of the midterms this thing called a tariff dividend, which is very circular, set up high tariffs, but then give out to American consumers $2,000 checks. I don't think there's any appetite for this in Congress, but it doesn't mean the president is not going to talk about it and make it a priority. So they won't be able to use that money. We potentially could see some movement in the bond market, which actually is something that has been a check on Trump. It was a massive check on Trump in April. That was the moment he decided he was going to reverse course on trade and not use it as a new rules of road, but actually start to negotiate. But whether or not the Supreme Court says IEEPA, which is the justification he has on most of these tariffs, the reciprocal and the fentanyl tariffs, is legal or not, they have a slew of legal alternatives that they can use. There are tons of sections, 232s, 302s, already they're enacted for other tariffs we have in the United States and other countries, and this administration is already preparing them. So a lot of people are just looking through it because regardless if they're using IEEPA as the justification or not, they'll just find another way to justify them.
It's a bigger check, potentially, that they are very unpopular and, rightly or wrongly, tariffs are associated domestically with making the cost of living, the affordability problem worse. We had a report from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which was out this week, saying that US consumers had paid 96% of the tariffs. He has seemingly accepted that in suspending them in some areas where beef and other things. So if you're one of America's allies, aren't you just waiting for popular opinion to do what the Supreme Court may or may not do?
Potentially, when it comes to places where we saw high tariffs, Trump has done 180s, like in some imported food products. But for the most part, Trump, the other day he reiterated that it's still his favorite word of all the words. I think he said this to you as well, John. He is the tariff man, and he truly believes it's important for rebuilding the American industrial base. So I don't see them going away, even if they show back up in polls. I remember the word tariff and a lot of consumer sentiments around last April kept coming up, and people were really concerned over the summer. But that has started to wane. So it could be an issue if once again he's going back to trade negotiations because IEEPA was struck down, And then that starts to seep through, again, in consumer sentiment and polling ahead of the midterms, when he really needs to get the American consumer feeling well about their prospects. Because you can continuously, in poll after poll, Americans do not feel good about how expensive things are and the affordability, which is why we see him really go towards these populist messages.
But that goes back to the corporate conversation, right? If you're a leader, how do you plan? On the way over, I was reading Lloyd Blankfein, the former Goldman CEO's, his memoir, and he talks about the mid-1990s, after the fall of USSR, and how excited they were about opening offices in Moscow and Seoul and Indonesia and other places. Right now, 30 years later, it seems like we're in the middle of, if nothing else, we can call this a geopolitical recession. You have to focus local, and you have to think about that. And in that moment, can they still go back to talking about the thing that they've been talking about for the last 30 years? And it's not just the threat of Trump's uncertain policies that's weighing on them. If you come to this week, the other big conversation that we haven't talked about, but is dominating most of the conversations, is artificial intelligence, because that is also going to have a big impact on these businesses. John and I were talking about this earlier, about every company having to think about this idea of a chief risk officer from a resiliency perspective. If anything, the lesson that you draw from post-COVID is, are you resilient enough as a company? That lesson has to be applied in Trump 2.0, the remaining Trump years as well. That's a big challenge. And that's perhaps one reason why this week is perhaps less about what's happening inside Congress Center and more about what's happening across the road at the Belvedere. It's more commercial, less virtue signaling.
I'm glad Sri brought this up, because the president just had a White House event, and he was flanked not just by Republican governors like Glenn Youngkin, but also Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. And the message of what he was talking about was electricity prices going up for consumers because of data centers coming in, which is huge in Virginia, which the mid-midterm elections in Virginia, New Jersey, we saw go to the Democrats, and they ran on electricity prices. Trump basically is telling tech companies, you want data centers, you need to pay a higher fee, and you need to subsidize electricity for American consumers. So that'll be a big one.
I'm glad you got onto AI, because I was going to end up there, because in any other year, it would be the only thing we're thinking about. I suspect it will still be one of two things that we're mainly focused on at Davos. We had a great piece this morning that was talking about going from rule-based finance to power-based finance, survival of the richest, not survival of the fittest. In that world where there aren't a lot of people, and certainly not a lot of countries, getting together and writing rules and thinking about risks, how does that affect the way AI hits the global economy and is rolled out?
I think it's possible. We could look back on this Davos as peak Trump. In at least one way, you could look at it as peak tech, is that, we wander around here, everyone here has seen pretty much every other shop has got the words AI appearing above it. And there is a lot of money floating around. Everyone's building ever bigger data centers. I saw someone earlier who said, if you put 50 billion into your data center, do you worry that somebody else is putting 60? And maybe there's this sort of bidding up going on. But in general, whenever you have a revolution of the scale that we're talking about, and I think it does tie a little bit into the midterms in a very vague way at the moment, there will be a lot of people sitting thinking, my job is at risk. There's a lot of, this is the first time that's probably going to hit college-educated white Americans on the coast. That's a very different group of people than have hitherto been hit. And I think on the whole, you're going to end up with some kind of backlash against the tech companies. You've already seen it, I would argue, completely justifiably in the ways they've done social media and the lack of rules they face there than actually we all do around this table. You don't head towards periods of disruption like this without political consequences. And I think Trump is sort of finding his way there. But you look back 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt was condemning the robber barons as the malefactors of great wealth. And that, in some ways, was a much more stretched out transition than we're facing now. And so I would expect there will be ever more political pressure building up in both parties on that.
And focused also on wealth. There's a string of countries. I mean, obviously, California is proposing a wealth tax. And across Europe, there's a lot of voices, and not just on the left, also from some of the far-right parties talking about wealth taxes. How worried, Sridhar, do you think, is anyone in Davos about wealth taxes?
Oh, well, that's what's interesting to me is about this whole point about the tech sector is does the Trump administration and does Donald Trump sour on that industry? Because if there's any corner of corporate America or any sort of companies across the world, the sector that's most pleased with Donald Trump has to be the tech industry, because he's put his shoulder into the infrastructure build out in the US, deregulation push, in some ways using the US government to act as the chief salesperson to push for the full stack AI build out, going to the Middle Eastern countries and saying you need to buy American over Chinese. Like, that is an area where the tech titans are extremely happy. There's a reason their wealth has gone up so much. But when you factor that in against the 2026 midterms and the populist turn that Trump is taking, does he then also look at this sector and take some other measures that are finally, much like everywhere else, he also sours on tech, and they have a serious problem that they will have to deal with and not the support of the administration?
Annmarie, if AI and worries about AI, not just the higher cost of electricity for people, but also possible crowding out of other investments, other kinds of jobs, people worrying about their own jobs, if that becomes really politically salient going into the midterms, isn't the president now very much joined in people's minds with AI, with the tech titans? They were all there at the inauguration. He's kind of implicated in all of it, isn't he?
Yeah, and to Sri's point, when it comes to they couldn't be happier with him, Jensen Huang and NVIDIA were very frustrated with the Biden administration. They had this diffusion rule, not to get too technical, but they basically divvied up the world in different parts. You're either tier 1, 2, or 3. And Trump came in and said, we're getting rid of the diffusion rule. And I saw Jensen Huang in Riyadh, and he said, diffusion rule is dead. He's like, this is a whole new world, meaning they can go and bring their chips.
But that was mainly about stopping them selling to people who might then give them to China.
Right. So I always joke that Jensen Huang is running AI policy out of the White House, because what NVIDIA wanted, they've got. And I think maybe to that point, Trump, this is why he feels like he can say to the tech companies with something like electricity, Silicon Valley has done well. Main Street needs to do well, which is why you need to pay and subsidize for some of this electrical build out. It's the same way the Treasury Secretary will say Wall Street does well, we're now focused on Main Street. They might take a similar tact when it comes to the tech companies, because Trump has made it very easy for them to expand, not just in the United States, but around the world.
But that proposal in itself is not as harsh and as punitive as just reading out the headline makes it sound, because tech companies right now are willing to pay for electricity because there isn't enough power generation. So right now, that isn't a big problem for them. And again, this is an industry with some serious and intense internal rivalries. And yet when all of them can band together and say everything that the president has done has been great for us, tells you how much this has been a pro-AI, pro-US tech administration. That is why when you have someone like Mark Benioff coming into Switzerland and talking about, I am extremely keen to hear the president continue to prioritize.
Salesforce.
That is the CEO of Salesforce, continuing to prioritize US companies. I also want to hear remarks from European regulatory officials, because they made some seriously controversial remarks last year. That's not how business leaders usually talk about the regulatory landscape in another continent, but they feel emboldened to be able to say that because they know they have the backing of the US.
I think there's a very clear division, though, that from the tech titans' point of view, people like Mark, great, why not make as much use of this man whilst you can? On the other hand, Trump is a populist. I think the more this goes on, the more unpopular this particular group of people come. The idea that he is gaining politically by being seen to be close to them, I think maybe Trump continues that, but the people who want to be his successors, I think, will be much less willing to do it. And I think if you look at other tech, originally the robber barons were great people if you were a politician to be associated with. Previous things, people have banged on about the white heat of technology was one British Prime Minister talked about. And it makes you look trendy and good and ahead of things. But once you get associated with lots of people losing their jobs,
exactly,
with electricity prices going up or whatever, then suddenly, and also with enormous inequality, then it gets more difficult. So I would be, even if the business people are making the most out of it, and good luck to them, I think from Trump's point of view, actually, strangely, he'll be ever less keen to get a photograph with them.
Yeah, when people start losing their jobs, I think that's when it'll get a lot harsher. To John's point, Steve Bannon, who is pretty far right, talks about this all the time. He's very anti companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. He says it's going to be taking people's jobs. And that is, I think, when you actually start to see that happen, though, haven't truly seen AI steal jobs. It's a very high unemployment rate right now, actually, for college grads. But no one has really been able to pinpoint, is it specifically because of AI? But once that happens, you'll see, I don't even think just a distance from the White House, you're going to see some fierce criticism as well from both sides of the parties from Congress.
Okay, so that would be my last question. We're going to run out of time, so very briefly, but I think for all of you, the question that people who are not on this mountain will most often ask, I'm sure they ask all of you, they ask me, is like, with all this going on, having listened to this conversation about the end of global norms, the lack of rulemaking, unpredictability, if we'd gone into it, we could have also talked about no longer having immigration, seemingly, in the US, which has been entirely reliant on immigration for a lot of its growth in the last few years, getting in the way of more electricity generation because of not wanting to have renewables and that push. All of those things, they would hear that and say, how on earth are the markets still so high? How can all these business people here be so calm and confident in the future of the economy with all of these things happening? Can that last, that ability for the Wall Street and a big part of the economy to somehow still be independent of these concerns?
A lot of these business people are happy when you're making $100 off of 8 people instead of 80 people. So the technology and the embrace of that technology has helped them. But sooner or later, they will have to worry about the trickle-down effects of it, and which is why, perhaps a little shocking, but when Klaus Schwab, the ultimate champion of this conclave, the one who set up this Velvet Rope Summit and what it has been for over 50 years, and last year he resigned from the board amid a series of scandals, but he's out with a book last week where he actually says, when bad decisions are made, that is when the common man, that is when the citizen starts to think about malicious intent. And that's what you have to be really, really careful about.
John, do you think?
I think the
final word for you.
I'm very bad on market timing, but one of the sort of basic rules of economics is if something cannot carry on forever, it will stop. And my instinct is the world you depicted is one that cannot carry on forever. So from that point of view, I'm bearish.
Well, bearish, but remembering the slogan we had from a big Davos curtain raiser this morning of it's still the survival of the richest. I suspect the rich will still be with us in a year's time. John, Sri, Annmarie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.